Well, you're at home and you hear a knock at the door. Nobody just stops by unannounced these days, so who could it be? Well, you open the door and there's two nicely dressed young men who are wanting to talk to you about Jesus. Well, this is exciting for me as a Christian. That is my life. I love to talk about Jesus and I love to study and discuss these things with other people. So when this first happened to me about 11 years ago, I was very interested, and ever since, so for about 11 years, I've been studying Mormon teachings, scripture, and history. One of the books that really interested me was the Book of Abraham, as the Book of Abraham is the book that contains a lot of the controversial teachings within Mormonism, such as the exaltation of man, the plurality of gods, and the ban on black people not able to hold the priesthood. So one of the things that I wanted to know, remember when you read the Book of Abraham, right at the top, or right at the preface of the book, it says that it is translated from Egyptian and that it was written by Abraham's own hand. Well, I wanted to know for myself if I could really trust what Jospeh Smith was telling me. So in studying the Book of Abraham, the first thing that I would like to talk about is the history and the making of the Book of Abraham, how it came together. The next thing is whether or not Jospeh Smith really had the ability to translate Egyptian. And then I would also like to take a look at some of the facsimiles that are printed in the Book of Abraham and see if Jospeh Smith was able to interpret those correctly. So let's begin by talking about the history behind the Book of Abraham. Now, in 1835, a traveling salesman named Michael Chandler arrived in Kirtland, Ohio, which was the then home of the LDS Church. He had in his possession 4 mummies and some papyri on exhibition. The church pooled their money together and paid $2,400 for the papyri and 4 mummies. Soon after buying the papyri, which also contained 3 facsimiles, Jospeh Smith began translating the Book of Abraham. Jospeh Smith claimed to have a spiritual gift that allowed him to translate this Egyptian language, and he soon began translating them into English. In 1842, the Book of Abraham was published and then later canonized in 1880. Now that we know how the Book of Abraham was said to be translated, let's take a look and see if Jospeh Smith really had the ability to translate Egyptian into English. Remember, this was before the Rosetta Stone and the subsequent ability of scholars to translate Egyptian. So, where are the papyri now? Can we examine them in light of our modern ability to translate ancient Egyptian? Well, yes, we can. The papyri that Joseph used to translate the Book of Abraham was thought to be lost in the Chicago fires of 1871. Amazingly, in 1966, a startling discovery was made when some of the ancient papyri were found at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. They were found along with an affidavit from Jospeh Smith's wife, Emma, stating that these indeed belonged to Jospeh Smith. Unfortunately for many hopeful Mormons who thought that these papyri would prove Jospeh Smith's ability to translate Egyptian, the opposite was true. When examined by both LDS and non-LDS Egyptologists, the papyri were found to be nothing more than a common funerary text written about 1,000 years after the time of Abraham. So there is absolutely no connection with Jospeh Smith's Book of Abraham and the papyri he used to translate the book. Remember, in the beginning of the Book of Abraham, it says that it was written by Abraham's own hand, which is impossible since they were actually not written until 1,000 years after the time of Abraham, and there is nothing on the papyri that mention Abraham in any way. Consider what Egyptologist Dr. Arthur C. Mace, the assistant curator for the Department of Egyptian Art of the Metropolitan Museum in New York, explained. The Book of Abraham, it is hardly necessary to say, is a pure fabrication. Jospeh Smith's interpretation of these cuts is nonsense from beginning to end. Egyptian characters can now be read almost as easily as Greek. In 5 minutes study, in an Egyptian gallery of any museum should be enough to convince the educated man of the clumsiness of the imposture. Next, let's take a look at Jospeh Smith's interpretation of the facsimile number 1. Remember, there's 3. We're just going to take a look at number 1. That's copied into the Book of Abraham and was also found in the 1966 Metropolitan find. Now, the original facsimile number 1 that Jospeh Smith had in his possession had pieces of it missing. Joseph filled in the blanks and also gave his interpretation of it as the depiction of the idolatrous priest Elkanah attempting to offer up Abraham as a sacrifice. However, Egyptologists disagree with Jospeh Smith and have determined that facsimile number 1 is actually a depiction of the Egyptian god Anubis resurrecting Osiris and has no connection with Abraham. Here we see Jospeh Smith's version of the facsimile. Here we see the Egyptologist version. Note the stark differences. So, finally, in conclusion, looking back, we see that the Book of Abraham, which was supposedly written by Abraham's own hand, was not a translation of Egyptian at all. Thanks to the Rosetta Stone and the subsequent ability to translate Egyptian, we see that Jospeh Smith did not have the ability to translate Egyptian or interpret the facsimiles. Unfortunately, it seems as if Jospeh Smith fabricated the Book of Abraham and lied about translating it from Egyptian.